I'm going to read some interviews regarding the Great Depression in the United States. These are from the first 100 pages of Hard Times, An Oral History of the Great Depression by Studs Terkel, published in April 1970. My parents were academics. My mother got her first degree in folklore. Among many things she taught me from her studies was the importance of what is called primary sources. Basically, that means what was said about a thing by people who were there in newspapers or magazines printed at the time. It also means that these things are more important for knowing the truth than books or opinions that came later by people who weren't there and may, knowingly or not, change what happened so that it fits their own beliefs and ways of thinking. Of course, these interviews, conducted by people who were there during the Great Depression, weren't recorded at the time. They were recorded, I presume, in the late 60s. So there's some time and memory changes, and people change how they think about things, but these are interviews with people who were there. I'll read about Studs Terkel, in case you are not aware of him. This is from Google Books. Studs Terkel was an actor, writer, and radio host. He was born Louis Terkel on May 16, 1912, in New York City. He took his name from the James T. Farrell novel, Studs Lonergan. Terkel attended the University of Chicago and graduated with a law degree in 1934. Terkel acted in local stage productions and on radio dramas until he began one of the first television programs, an unscripted show called Stud's Place, in the early 1950s. In 1952, Terkel began Studs Terkel's Almanac on radio station WFMT in Chicago. Terkel compiled a series of books based on oral histories that defined America in the 20th century. Working, people talk about what they do all day and how they feel about what they do. Received a National Book Award nomination in 1975. The Good War, An Oral History of World War II, won the Pulitzer Prize in Nonfiction in 1985. Working was turned into a hit musical in 1978. Terkel was named the Communicator of the Year by the University of Chicago in 1969. He also won a Peabody Award for Excellence in Journalism in 1980 and the National Book Foundation Medal for Contributions to American Letters in 1997. He died on October 31, 2008, at the age of 96. And now, some parts of the first 100, or really 90, pages of his book about the Great Depression. The March, page 27. Jim Sheridan. Introductory note. It is a large hotel, a halfway house for its hundreds of guests who are convalescing from nervous breakdowns. The benches near the entrance and the lobby are overflowing with the elderly and the young, engaged in highly animated conversations. On this summer's evening, it was certainly the most alive area in the neighborhood. He is 63 years old. The soldiers were walking the streets, the fellows who had fought for democracy in Germany. They thought they should get the bonus right then and there because they needed the money. A fellow by the name of Waters, I think, got up the idea of these ex-soldiers would go to Washington, make the kind of trip the hobos made with Coxey in 1898. They would be able to get the government to come through. Footnote: in 1894, Jacob S. Coxey led a march of unemployed into Washington. It failed in its purpose. The small size of the group led to the coinage of the derogatory phrase Coxey's Army. End footnote. D.C. Webb organized a group from Bughouse Square to go on this bonus march. Not having been in the Army, I was too young for World War I and too old for World War II. I was wondering if I would be a legitimate marcher. But the 10 or 15 other fellows were all soldiers, and they thought it would be okay for me to go. Webb said, "Come along, you're a pretty good bum." We went down to the rail yards and grabbed a freight train. Our first stop was in Peru, Indiana. We jungled up there for a little while, and then we bummed the town, so to speak, go to different grocers and give them a tale of woe. They would give us sausage or bread or meat or canned goods. Then we'd go back to the railroad yards, the jungle, where we'd build a little fire and we'd cook it up in these cans. We'd sit around the fire and eat. Peru was the first division point outside of Chicago on the C&O. We'd stop off and rest and scrounge up something to eat. We'd generally be told by the conductors the train was made up and ready to go out. Some of these fellows had come with their families. Can you imagine women and children riding boxcars? The conductor would want to find out how many guys were in the yard, so he'd know how many empty boxcars to put on the train. Of course, the railroad companies didn't know this, but these conductors, out of their sympathy, would put 2 or 3 extra empty boxcars in the train, so these bonus marchers could crawl into them and ride comfortable into Washington. Even the railroad detectives were very generous. Sometimes there'd be 50, 60 people in a boxcar. We'd just be sprawled out on the floor. The toilet, you had to hold it until you got to a division point. That's generally 100 miles. You didn't carry food with you. You had to bum the town. It was beggary on a grand scale. In one town, D.C. Webb got up on the bandstand and made a speech. We passed the hat, even, among the local citizenry. The money was used to buy cigarettes for the boys. Townspeople, they were very sympathetic. There was none of this hatred you see now when strange people come to town, or strangers come to a neighborhood. They resent it. I don't know why. That's one of the things about the Depression. There was more camaraderie than there is now. Even more comradeship than the commies could even dream about. That was one of the feelings that America lost. People had different ideas. They disagreed with one another, but there was a fine feeling among them. You were in trouble, damn it, if they could help you, they would help you. One incident stuck in my memory. We had reached a place in Virginia. It was a very hot day. In this jungle there was a man, a very tall man. He had his wife with him and several small children. We invited them over to have something to eat with us, and they refused. Then I brought something over to them in an old pie plate. They still refused. It was the husband who told me that he didn't care for anything to eat. But see, the baby was crying from hunger. Finally, me and some others went down to bum the center of the town. I remember going into a drugstore and bumming a baby bottle with a nipple. Now, can you imagine a guy bumming a baby bottle with a nipple? It took me a few guts to work it up. I explained the circumstances. Then I went and bummed the milk. When I got back to the jungle camp, it was kind of dark. I first reported it in to Captain Webb, and then he kidded me about the baby bottle. "Christ," I said, "that baby there's got to eat." And he said, "This afternoon you got pretty much of a rebuff." Well, I said, I'm going to try again. So I went over and addressed myself to his wife, and I told her, "Here is the baby bottle. We even had the milk warmed up." But she looked at her husband, and her husband said he didn't want it. What could I do about it but just feel blue? I didn't look upon it as charity. It seemed to me that here was a fellow's pride getting the best of him. The tragedy came when the train was going through Virginia. We had to go through these mountain countries. The smoke from the stacks of the engines and the soot would be flying back through the tunnels and would be coming into the boxcars. So in order to avoid getting choked, we'd close the boxcars and hold handkerchiefs over our noses. There was quite a discussion about this. What would happen to the little infant? We was afraid it would smother. The mother was holding the baby, but the baby seemed very still. The mother screamed. We didn't know what the scream was about. After we reached Washington, we found that the baby had died going through the tunnels. When the baby died, a feeling of sadness came over those in the boxcar. It seemed that they had lost one of their own. When we got to Washington, there was quite a few ex-servicemen there before us. There was no arrangements for housing. Most of the men that had wives and children were living in Hooverville. This was across the Potomac River, what was known as Anacostia Flats. They had set up housing there, made of cardboard and of all kinds. I didn't know how they managed to get their food. Most other contingents was along Pennsylvania Avenue. They were tearing down a lot of buildings along that street where they were going to do some renewal, build some federal buildings. A lot of ex-servicemen just sort of turned them into barracks. They just sort of bunked there. Garages that were vacant, they took over. Had no respect for private property. They didn't even ask permission of the owners. They didn't even know who the hell the owners was. They had come to petition Hoover to give them the bonus before it was due, and Hoover refused this. He told them they couldn't get it because it would make the country go broke. They would hold midnight vigils around the White House and march around the White House in shifts. The question now was, how were they going to get them out of Washington? They were ordered out 4 or 5 times, but they refused. The police chief was called to send them out, but he refused. Footnote, General Pelham B. Glassford. End of footnote. I also heard that the Marine commander, who was called to bring out the Marines, also refused. Finally, the one they did get to shove those bedraggled ex-servicemen out of Washington was none other than the great MacArthur. The picture I'll always remember. Here is MacArthur coming down Pennsylvania Avenue. And believe me, ladies and gentlemen, he came on a white horse. He was riding a white horse. Behind him were tanks, troops of the regular army. This was really a riot that wasn't a riot, in a way. When these ex-soldiers wouldn't move, they'd poke them with their bayonets and hit them on the head with the butt of the rifle. First, they had a hell of a time getting them out of the buildings they were in, like a sit-in. They managed to get them out. A big colored soldier, about 6 feet tall, had a big American flag he was carrying. He was one of the bonus marchers. He turned to one of the soldiers who was pushing him along, saying, "Get along there, you big black bastard." That was it. He turned and said, "Don't try to push me. I fought for this flag. I fought for this flag in France, and I'm going to fight for it here, on this Pennsylvania Avenue." The soldier hit him on the side of the legs with the bayonet. I think he was injured, but I don't know if he was sent to the hospital. This was the beginning of a riot, in a way. The soldiers were pushing these people. They didn't want to move, but they were pushing them anyway. As night fell, they crossed the Potomac. They were given orders to get out of Anacostia Flats, and they refused. The soldiers set those shanties on fire. They were practically smoked out. I saw it from a distance. I could see the pandemonium. The fires were something like the fires you see nowadays that are started in these ghettos, but they weren't started by the people that live there. The soldiers threw tear gas at them and vomiting gas. It was one assignment they reluctantly took on. They were younger than the marchers. It was like sons attacking their fathers. The next day the newspapers deplored the fact and so forth, but they realized the necessity of getting these men off, because they were causing a health hazard to the city. MacArthur was looked on as a hero. And so the bonus marchers straggled back to the various places they came from, and without their bonus. Postscript. After the bonus march, I bummed my way to New York. I couldn't get on relief there because I wasn't a resident. So I resorted to one of the oldest professions, that is, begging. I became a professional panhandler. I had quite a few steady clients. One of them was Hayward Brune. Every time I put the bite on him, he'd say, "For Christ's sake, don't you know any other guy in the city besides me?" Page 34. The Song. Once in cocky suits, gee, we looked swell, full of that Yankee doodly-dum. 500,000 boots went slogging through hell. I was the kid with the drum. Say, don't you remember, they called me Al. It was Al all the time. Say, don't you remember? I'm your pal. Brother, can you spare a dime? E. Y. Yip Harburg. Song lyricist and writer of light verse. Among the works in which his lyrics were sung are Finian's Rainbow, The Bloomer Girl, Jamaica, The Wizard of Oz, and Earl Carroll's Vanities. I never liked the idea of living on scallions in a left bank garret. I like writing in comfort. So I went into business, a classmate and I. I thought I'd retire in a year or two. And a thing called collapse. Bangle. Socked everything out. 1929. All I had left was a pencil. Luckily, I had a friend named Ira Gershwin, and he said to me, "You've got your pencil. Get your rhyming dictionary and go to work." I did. There was nothing else to do. I was doing light verse at the time, writing a poem here and there for $10 a crack. It was an era when kids at college were interested in light verse and ballads and sonnets. This is the early 30s. I was relieved when the crash came. I was released. Being in business was something I detested. When I found out that I could sell a song or a poem, I became me. I became alive. Other people didn't see it that way. They were throwing themselves out of windows. Someone who lost money found that his life was gone. When I lost my possessions, I found my creativity. I felt I was being born for the first time. So for me, the world became beautiful. With the crash, I realized that the greatest fantasy of all was business. The only realistic way of making a living was versifying, living off your imagination. We thought American business was the Rock of Gibraltar. We were a prosperous nation, and nothing could stop us now. A brownstone house was forever. You gave it to your kids, and they put marble fronts on it. There was a feeling of continuity. If you made it, it was there forever. Suddenly, the big dream exploded. The impact was unbelievable. I was walking along the street at that time, and you'd see the bread lines. The biggest one in New York City was owned by William Randolph Hearst. He had a big truck with several people on it, and big cauldrons of hot soup, bread. Fellows with burlap on their shoes were lined up all around Columbus Circle, and went for blocks and blocks around the park, waiting. There was a skit in one of the first shows I did, Americana. This was 1930. In the sketch, Mrs. Ogden Reed of the Herald Tribune was very jealous of Hearst's beautiful bread line. It was bigger than her bread line. It was a satiric, volatile show. We needed a song for it. On stage, we had men in old soldiers' uniforms, dilapidated, waiting around. And then into the song. We had to have a title. And how do you do a song so it isn't maudlin? Not to say, my wife is sick, I've got 6 children, the crash put me out of business, hand me a dime. I hate songs of that kind. I hate songs that are on the nose. I don't like songs that describe a historic moment pitifully. The prevailing greeting at that time, on every block you passed, by some poor guy coming up was, "Can you spare a dime?" or "Can you spare something for a cup of coffee?" "Brother, can you spare a dime?" finally hit on every block, on every street. I thought that could be a beautiful title, if I could only work it out by telling people through the song, it isn't just a man asking for a dime. This is the man who says, "I built the railroads. I built that tower. I fought your wars. I was the kid with the drum. Why the hell should I be standing in line now? What happened to all this wealth I created?" I think that's what made the song. Of course, together with the idea and meaning, a song must have poetry. It must have the phrase that rings a bell. The art of songwriting is a craft. Yet, "Brother, can you spare a dime?" opens up a political question. Why should this man be penniless at any time in his life, due to some fantastic thing called a depression or sickness, or whatever it is that makes him so insecure? In the song, the man is really saying, "I made an investment in this country. Where the hell are my dividends? Is it a dividend to say, 'Can you spare a dime?' What the hell is wrong? Let's examine this thing. It's more than just a bit of pathos. It doesn't reduce him to a beggar. It makes him a dignified human asking questions, and a bit outraged, too, as he should be. Everybody picked up the song in 30 and 31. Bands were playing it and records were made. When Roosevelt was a candidate for president, the Republicans got pretty worried about it. Some of the network radio people were told to lay low on the song. In some cases, they tried to ban it from the air, but it was too late. The song had already done its damage. Hard Travelin', page 44. I've been doin' some hard travelin', I thought you knowed. I've been doin' some hard ramblin' away down the road. I've been layin' in a hard rock jail, I thought you knowed. I've been laid out 90 days way down the road. The darned old judge, he said to me, it's 90 days for vagrancy. And I've been doin' some hard travelin', Lord. Woody Guthrie. Ed Paulson. From 1926 on, when he was 14, he himself knocked around and about the states. I rode the freights across the land. I always went back to my home in South Dakota. My sister and her husband had a little farm. It was a retreat. I played semi-pro baseball up there at one time. You know who I faced? Satchel Paige. He was pitching for Bismarck. I worked punching cattle, $10 a month. I was never satisfied to stay there. I was always taking a pop at L.A. or San Francisco. Everybody talks of the crash of '29. In small towns out west, we didn't know there was a crash. What did the stock market mean to us? Not a dang thing. If you were in Cutback, Montana, who owned stock? The farmer was a ping-pong ball in a very tough game. I finished high school in 1930, and I walked out into this thing. He picked apples in Washington, hustled sheets in Los Angeles, and worked on road gangs all along the coast. It got tougher. We didn't know how to make out in the city. It was terrifying. There were great queues of guys in soup lines. We didn't know how to join a soup line. We, my two brothers and I, didn't see ourselves that way. We had middle-class ideas without a middle-class income. We ended up in San Francisco in 1931. I tried to get a job on the docks. I was a big, husky athlete, but there just wasn't any work. Already by that time, if you were looking for a job at a Standard Oil service station, you had to have a college degree. It was that kind of market. I'd get up at 5 in the morning and head for the waterfront. Outside the Speckles Sugar Refinery, outside the gates, there would be 1,000 men. You know dang well there's only 3 or 4 jobs. A guy would come out with 2 little Pinkerton cops. I need 2 guys for the bull gang, 2 guys to go into the hole. 1,000 men would fight like a pack of Alaskan dogs to get through there. Only 4 of us would get through. I was too young a punk. So you drift up to Skid Row. There'd be thousands of men there. Guys on baskets, making weird speeches, phony theories on economics. About 11:30, the real leaders would take over. They'd say, okay, we're going to City Hall. The mayor was Angelo Rossi, a dapper little guy. He wore expensive boots and a tight vest. We'd shout around the steps. Finally, he'd come out and tell us nothing. I remember the demands. We demand work. We demand shelter for our families. We demand groceries, this kind of thing. Half the guys up there making the demands were Negroes. Now, there wasn't a big black colony in San Francisco in those days, but they were pretty cagey, the leaders. They always kept a mixture of black and white. I remember how, as a little kid, how courageous this seemed to me, the demands, because you knew that society wasn't going to give it to you. They demand that they open up unrented houses and give decent shelters for their families. But you just knew society wasn't yielding. There was nothing coming. This parade would be 4 blocks long, curb to curb. Nobody had a dime. There were guys on the corner trying to sell apples to this moneyless wonder. The guys would start to yell, and there come some horses. They used to have cops on horseback in those days. Then there'd be some fighting. Finally it got to killing. I think they killed 3 people there one day, besides the wounded. It really got rough because the guys had brought a bunch of marbles and threw them on the street, and the horses were slipping and sliding around. This made the cops mad, and they got rough. There would be this kind of futile struggle because somehow you never expected to win. We had a built-in losing complex. That's the way those crowds felt. A lot of them would drift back into the Sally. Footnote, the Salvation Army. By now it's 1 o'clock and everybody's hungry. We were a gentle crowd. These were fathers, 80% of them. They had held jobs and didn't want to go kick society to pieces. They just wanted to go to work, and they just couldn't understand. There was a mysterious thing. You watched the papers, you listened to rumors, you'd get word somebody's going to build a building. So the next morning you get up at 5 o'clock and you dash over there. You got a big tip. There's 3,000 men there, carpenters, cement men, guys who knew machinery and everything else. These fellows always had faith that the job was going to mature somehow. More and more men were after fewer and fewer jobs. So San Francisco just ground to a halt. Nothing was moving. We were always trying to get to sea, but I didn't have any ticket. Oh, I made that waterfront 1,000 times. There used to be those great old liners that sailed out to Hawaii. You could hear the band play Aloha Away, and all the guys were standing there with tears in their eyes, as though you had somebody going someplace, and you didn't know a damn soul. We weren't greatly agitated in terms of society. Ours was a bewilderment, not an anger. Not a sense of being particularly put upon. We weren't talking revolution. We were talking jobs. We'd grown up in small-town high schools. There wasn't much expression in the press of the intelligentsia. It was just a tough world, and you had been born into it. I had no great sense of fervor until I went to L.A. and ran into Upton Sinclair in 1934. If I were picking a time when I began to say, "What the hell is all this about?" it was when I wandered into a meeting one day where Upton Sinclair was talking. Footnote, he was a candidate for governor of California. Epic was his symbol and credo, and poverty in California. This was the winter of 33-34. There was this little pink and white guy up there speaking. The least likely guy ever to be a radical you ever saw. You automatically think of pince-nez glasses and a shock of white hair. His audience was made up mostly of working stiffs. He pointed out the great piles of oranges, the piles of lumber laying there idle. They'd put up a rack of oranges and apples, put gasoline over it, and set fire to them. Vegetables were being destroyed and everything. Everybody who cried so much later about federal programs destroying little pigs, they should have seen what industry was doing at this time to keep the price up. Sinclair's idea was to relate the unemployed to the resources not being used. This appealed to me tremendously. It made sense to have this food eaten up by hungry people. I got a job singing with the quartet that was campaigning with them. If I had to pick one constant enemy during this time, it was the American Legion. They were made up of horse guard types. They were the most vicious enemies of this drifting, reckless, hungry crowd of people. Every place I went, Hoovervilles, they were raided. This bunch of legionnaires with those damned caps on, guys with baseball bats, driving them out of the jungles around the railroad grounds. Even in the little towns I lived in, I had a war with those guys by the time I was in high school. They were always the bane of my existence. They were the main streeters. They were doing all right, merchants, storekeepers, landowners. They had a fix that was just awful to live with. They were hard on the little candidate for governor. They'd come to his meetings with baseball bats and clubs and break it up. Once, when we sang in the valley, they attacked us and beat the hell out of us. We barely got out of there. During the Sinclair campaign, I was going to the library, picking up books I'd never read before, books that never crossed my track. You'd go down to look for work in the morning, and then you'd give up at 11 o'clock and drift into that library. I got my education there, really. By this time, Roosevelt was president. There was the NRA. National Recovery Administration. Mystical things were going on we didn't understand at all. People were talking price fixing and what have you. Very, very weird world. It didn't mean a damn to us. There were 3 brothers of us. We got a freight and went down to Portland. They'd started to work on the Bonneville Dam. Beautiful sight down by that river. On a decent day, if you sat on top of a boxcar, it was beautiful. We drifted down to the jungle. We go into a beanery, 'cause there was no train out till 11 that night. In comes a Mexican whore and a colored whore. They order a hamburger. The proprietor says, "I don't serve niggers. Get that dame out of here." The Mexican girl comes back and orders 2 hamburgers. The guy grumbles, fries up a couple. The colored girl walks in. This guy goes under the counter and comes up with a sap. He lashes out at the girl's head. Bong! Geez, I think he's killed her. She groans and staggers back off the stool. He cuts around the corner in a wild rage. I put my foot out and trip him. He just went ass over Tecumseh. The girls get out in time. He'd have killed that girl, I believe. We lam out of there, too. We grab the midnight freight and get off at Phoenix. It's a hostile town, so we beat it. We make an orange freight. We rode in the reefer, the refrigerator car. Clear to Kansas City. It goes like a bat out of hell, a rough ride. We broke through the wire netting and ate the oranges. We got vitamins like mad. But your mouth gets burnt by that acid juice, and your teeth get so damn sore from that ride. By the time we got off at KC, I could hardly close my mouth. We catch a train into Kansas City, Kansas, that night. At the steps, colored people were getting on the train and throwing off coal. You could see people gathering the coal. You could see the railroad dicks were getting rough. Hal and I are riding on the top of the boxcar. It's a fairly nice night. All of a sudden, there's a railroad dick with a flashlight that reaches 1,000 miles. Bam, bam, he starts shooting. We hear the bullets hitting the cars, bam, like that. I throw my hands up and start walking towards that light. Hal's behind me. The guy says, "Get off." I said, "Christ, I can't. The thing's rolling 50 miles an hour or more." He says, "Jump." I says, "I can't." He says, "Turn around and march ahead." He marches us over the top. There's a gondola about 8 feet down. He says, "Jump." So I jumped and landed in wet sand up to my knees. We come to a little town in Nebraska, Beatrice. It's morning. I'm chilled to the bone. We crawl into a railroad sandbox, almost frozen to death. We dry out, get warmed up, and make the train again. We pull into Omaha. It's night. All of a sudden, the train is surrounded by deputies with pistols. The guy says, "Get in those trucks." I said, "What for? We haven't done anything." He said, "You're not going to jail, you're going to the transient camp." They drive us up to an old army warehouse. They check you in, take off your clothes, run them through a delouser, and you take a bath. It's midnight. We come out, and here's a spread with scrambled eggs, bacon, bread, coffee, and toast. We ate a great meal. It was wonderful. We go upstairs to bed. Here's a double-decker, sheets, toothbrush, towels, everything. I sat down on this damn bed, I can't tell you, full of wonderment. We thought we'd gone to heaven. Hal's a young punk. He's 17. He said, "What the hell kind of a place is this?" I said, "I don't know, but it's sure something different." The next morning, they called us up to a social worker. By this time, there's 1,000 guys in there. They're playing baseball. Some guys are washing down walls, bums, bindle stiffs, cynical rough guys who've been on the road for years. It's kind of like a playhouse. It's unbelievable. Through a social worker, he is assigned to a job with the National Youth Administration at a little cold water college in Aberdeen, South Dakota. And then the good life began for me. Before Roosevelt, the federal government hardly touched your life. Outside of the postmaster, there was little local representation. Now people you knew were appointed to government jobs. Joe Blow or some guy from the corner. It came right down to Main Street. Half of them loved it, half of them hated it. There was the immediacy of its effect on you. In Aberdeen, Main Street was against it, but they were delighted to have those green relief checks cashed in their cash registers. They'd have been out of business had it not been for them. It was a split thing. They were cursing Roosevelt for the intrusion into their lives. At the same time, they were living off it. Main Street still has this fix. The NYA was my salvation. I could just as easily have been in Sing Sing as with the UN, just every bit a chance. Hell, yes, everybody was a criminal. You stole, you cheated through. You were getting by, survival. Stole clothes off lines, stole milk off back porches. You stole bread. I remember going through Tucumcari, New Mexico on a freight. We made a brief stop. There was a grocery store, a supermarket kind of thing for those days. I beat it off the train and came back with rolls and crackers. This guy is standing in the window shaking his fist at you. It wasn't a big thing, but it created a coyote mentality. You were a predator. You had to be. The coyote is crafty. He can be fantastically courageous and a coward at the same time. He'll run, but when he's cornered, he'll fight. I grew up where they were hated because they'd kill sheep. They'd kill the calf, get in the chicken coop. They're mean, but how else does a coyote stay alive? He's not as powerful as a wolf. He has a small body. He's in such bad condition a dog can run him down. He's not like a fox. A coyote is nature's victim as well as man's. We were coyotes in the 30s, the jobless. No, I don't see the Depression as an ennobling experience. Survivors are still riding with the ghost of those days when things came hard. Pauline Kael, page 50. Film critic, The New Yorker. The first violence I had ever seen was along the Embarcadero, the anger of the men. I never saw it again until recently in Philadelphia, between cops and little Negro kids. Angry men were yelling. They had weapons and were angry at other men. I was in a car with my father. I had seen passive bread lines, but this was different. Girls don't usually see this, particularly if you're a bookish girl from a bookish family. It may have been a prelude to the San Francisco general strike, I'm not sure. That was almost like a blackout. It had a sense of paralysis. The kids with lots of money had actually been moved to the peninsula out of harm's way. The rich people thought there was going to be a revolution, and they moved out of town. My neighbors were angry with my mother because she fed hungry men at the back door. They said it would bring others, and then what would she do? She said, "I'll feed them till the food runs out." It wasn't until years later I realized the fear people had of those men. We didn't have it in our house. I understand why these neighbors were afraid. They had lived with domestic violence all their lives. They were beaten up by their husbands every Saturday night. You could hear them screaming. So their fear of men was generalized. I'm sure my father never hit my mother. Ours was a non-violent family, so we weren't particularly scared of these strange men. Well, I'm about at 40 minutes, so I'm going to stop here and record more in another video or audio. Oh, I just find this stuff very interesting. I know I said I was closing my channel, but I think I will just keep on and do what I like doing, and maybe somebody will listen and maybe they won't. I won't say like and subscribe, but I will say comment. Just tell me what you thought, what you might like more of, what I could do better. Just some kind of feedback, if you don't mind. Thank you for listening to the end. And have a nice day, night, whatever it may be.